There is an old principle in military strategy. You cannot destroy what you cannot see. On the night of May 7th, somewhere in the dark waters of the Strait of Hormuz, the United States found a way around that problem. It didn't go looking for Iran's hidden weapons. It waited patiently, deliberately for Iran to bring those weapons out of hiding on its own. What followed was not a battle in the conventional sense. It was the closing act of a trap that had been set weeks, possibly months in advance. 3 Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers, USS Mason, USS Truckton, and USS Rafael Peralta were transiting through the Strait of Hormuz as part of a U.S. Navy escort mission under Project Freedom. On paper, this was routine. In practice, these ships were designed to be seen, to provoke, and to absorb the first move. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy took the bait. To understand why the night of May 7th was so consequential, you first need to understand what Iran had been hiding for decades beneath the Persian Gulf coastline. Iranian military planners had spent years carving tunnel networks into the sedimentary rock and salt formations along the southern coast. On Shisham Island, the largest island in the Persian Gulf, these tunnels reportedly stretch for dozens of kilometers beneath the surface. In Bandar Abbas, the IRGC constructed underground naval bases at depths that make satellite detection extremely difficult. The IRGC called these facilities missile cities, and the name was not an exaggeration. Inside, these fortifications sat stockpiles of Nur and Qatar anti-ship crews, missiles, Zulfiqar ballistic missiles, with ranges exceeding 1,000 kilometers and older silkworm systems for close-range tanker strikes. Alongside the missiles, hundreds of fast attack boats, internally dubbed Red Wasps, were sheltered in mountain-carved coastal bases designed for swarm tactics, overwhelming a larger ship through sheer numbers, speed, and saturation. This was Iran's sea denial architecture. Its purpose was to threaten any naval force operating near the Strait, and specifically to hold hostage the approximately 20% of the world's daily oil supply that moves through that choke point. The problem for the United States was fundamental. As long as Iran's forces stayed underground, they were untouchable. You cannot destroy a weapon system. You cannot confirm the location of not legally, not strategically, not without triggering a far larger escalation. So Washington designed a situation in which Iran would open the tunnel doors voluntarily. The strategic logic was, in hindsight, remarkably clean. Place visible, provocative assets in the Strait. Make them impossible for IRGC commanders to ignore. Maintain enough economic pressure through the ongoing blockade, tanker seizures accumulating, revenues hemorrhaging, Iran's leadership increasingly desperate until the temptation to strike becomes irresistible. Then wait, the IRGC's leadership was under genuine strain in the weeks before May 7th. The blockade had steadily eroded Iran's tanker export revenues. Each passing week brought fewer barrels exported, more pressure on the Royale, and more internal questioning of whether the regime strategy was working. By multiple accounts, IRGC naval commanders were operating in an environment of institutional panic. When 3 American destroyers materialized in the Strait, senior IRGC commanders apparently concluded the strategic moment had arrived. A diplomatic dispute between the U.S. and Gulf states had briefly restricted American base access. The opportunity they calculated would not present itself again. They were wrong. The United States had anticipated exactly this calculation. Prior to the attack, at least 5 KC-135 aerial refueling aircraft had launched from the UAE. 4 more tanker aircraft were airborne over Israel and Jordan. This kind of pre-positioned aerial support is not improvised. It indicates that U.S. Central Command had received credible intelligence of the IRGC's intentions and had activated a pre-planned counter strike sequence before the first Iranian weapon was ever fired. The broader American military presence in the region made the operation possible in ways that are worth stating plainly. 3 carrier strike groups, USS Abraham Lincoln, USS Gerald R. Ford, and a third group that arrived in early May constituted the largest concentration of American naval power in the region in decades. Their flight decks carried F-35C stealth fighters, FA-18E, F Super Hornets, and EA-18G Growler electronic warfare aircraft. On land, F-22 Raptors were positioned in Israel, F-15E in Jordan, F-16s in Saudi Arabia, and MQ-4C Triton Long Endurance. Surveillance drones were flying continuous orbits from the UAE. The U.S. could see everything. Iran could see almost nothing of what the U.S. was seeing. The IRGC activated what appeared to be a coordinated doctrine-level strike package. Kamikaze drone swarms, a mix of ballistic and cruise missiles, and armed fast attack boats operating together in a layered assault. This was not improvised aggression. It was the IRGC's practiced asymmetric warfare doctrine, executed at scale, the kind of operation Iranian planners had rehearsed for years as their answer to American naval supremacy. Among the assets deployed were the Hadr 1 in 10 missile launching vessels, fast attack boats capable of firing cruise missiles that the IRGC had unveiled publicly just months earlier in February 2025. These represented the newest expression of Iran's swarm doctrine, boats sophisticated enough to engage capital ships at range, threatening enough to require serious defensive attention. The Aegis ballistic missile defense system handled it. Aegis is capable of simultaneously tracking hundreds of airborne targets, assessing each for threat level, and launching interceptors within seconds of threat identification. It is, in the language of military systems analysts, a closed-loop engagement system. It does not wait for human authorization on individual intercepts. On the night of May 7th, it processed the IRGC's entire attack wave and destroyed it. Drone swarms were intercepted before reaching effective range. Cruise missiles were shot down. Fast attack boats that entered the water were sunk. U.S. Central Command subsequently confirmed that none of the 3 American destroyers sustained any damage, and there were no American casualties. The Red Wasps had finally left the tunnels. And the moment they did, U.S. satellites tracked their launch points in real time. Before the smoke of the Iranian attack had cleared, American strikes were already hitting the facilities those weapons had come from. U.S. Central Command's retaliatory strikes were not indiscriminate. The target selection was directly linked to the facilities the IRGC had exposed during the attack, a targeting approach that reflects a broader intelligence where you came from. Bandar Abbas, the primary base of the IRGC naval forces, was struck. This was not the first time American strikes during Operation Epic. Fury in February had already damaged the port significantly, sinking major platforms, including the Shahed Bri and Macron in the harbor. Iran had repaired the damage. On the night of May 7th, it was struck again. Keshem Island's port and IRGC naval facilities were hit. The Barman Port Complex was targeted. Missile and drone launch positions in Sur and Bandar Kamir were destroyed. And IRGC Naval Police checkpoint in Manab was struck. Each of these targets corresponded to an asset or launch point that the IRGC had activated during its attack. By choosing to fight, Iran had effectively handed the U.S. a target list that no satellite imagery, no human intelligence network, and no amount of covert reconnaissance could have produced on its own. The IRGC had spent decades carefully concealing these facilities. In a single night's operation, it revealed many of them. The damage to Bandar Abbas's commercial port infrastructure is particularly significant. Iran is not a country with surplus maritime capacity. Bandar Abbas handles a substantial portion of the Countries import trade consumer goods, food, industrial inputs. Striking the port doesn't just hurt the IRGC. It cuts into the arteries of Iran's civilian economy in ways that compound existing pressure from sanctions and the blockade. Whether this outcome was deliberately calculated or an acceptable side effect of targeting IRGC naval infrastructure is a question worth examining. The answer has implications for how Iran's population experiences this conflict going forward. While IRGC forces were being sunk and their launch sites were being destroyed, Iranian state media was broadcasting a very different account. Official statements from the Iranian military claimed that at least 3 U.S. warships had been hit and had fled the Strait. State television ran celebratory coverage. Crowds gathered in Thran's Revolution Square, genuinely believing on the basis of their government's reporting that Iran had struck a major blow against American naval power. None of the IRGC's claims were corroborated by any independent evidence. There are no photographs of damaged American warships, no signals, intercepts indicating distress calls, no footage of vessels taking on water. U.S. Central Command explicitly denied the claims, and the 3 destroyers were later accounted for without visible damage. This creates a problem for the Islamic Republic that goes beyond embarrassment. Propaganda is not merely a communications tool for authoritarian governments. It is a mechanism of internal legitimacy. When a regime tells its population that it is one, and the population has no way to verify, otherwise the narrative holds. But the gap between the official story and observable reality has a tendency to widen over time. Satellite imagery circulates. Diaspora relatives relay information. Economic consequences make themselves felt regardless of what the television says. The IRGC's propaganda machine may have painted itself into a corner, having declared victory in a battle it lost comprehensively. It now faces the task of explaining why the blockade continues, why oil revenues remain suppressed, why port infrastructure in Bandar Abbas is damaged again, and why the strategic situation is not improving. There was also a peculiar detail circulating on Iranian social media in the aftermath. Images apparently showing President Pezeshkian meeting with what appeared to be a cardboard cutout of Supreme Leader came, and the president reportedly offering remarks about the leader's humility and simplicity. Independent verification of these images has not been established, but the fact that such images generated serious public debate rather than being immediately dismissed speaks to the depth of the Iranian public's uncertainty about the actual state of their leadership. The military confrontation is only one dimension of the pressure Iran is facing. Running in parallel is an economic strategy designed to strangle Iran's oil export capacity, not through a single dramatic act, but through sustained grinding, attrition. Iran produces between 2 and 3.5 million barrels of oil per day, depending on the period and circumstances. Nearly all of that output needs to move through maritime export, terminals primarily on and near the Persian Gulf coast. When exports are blocked, the oil does not simply stop. It keeps being produced and has nowhere to go. Iran's total oil storage capacity is estimated at somewhere between 40 and 90 million barrels under full production with no export outlet. That capacity fills within weeks. When it fills, Iranian energy planners face a choice with no good options: cut production and accept direct revenue, losses running to hundreds of millions of dollars per day, or continue producing and risk physical damage to pipeline, infrastructure, and reservoir integrity as pressure builds in systems designed to keep crude oil moving. Heavy crude oil, which makes up a significant portion of Iranian output, is particularly unforgiving when flow slows. Waxes and asphaltenes in the crude begin to separate and adhere to pipeline walls, causing blockages that reduce efficiency and in severe cases cause damage that is costly and time-consuming to repair. The economic pressure the U.S. is applying is not just about cutting revenue in the short term. It is about degrading the infrastructure Iran needs to generate revenue in the future. This is the logic behind the maximum pressure strategy as it is currently being applied. It is not primarily designed to compel Iran to surrender through military force. It is designed to make Iran's continued defiance economically unsustainable, to create a situation where the regime's ability to pay its internal security forces, fund its proxy networks, and maintain the patronage structures that sustain its internal legitimacy begins to erode under its own weight. Iran has presented its conflict with the United States as a confrontation between a small nation defending its sovereignty and a hegemonic power seeking regional domination. This framing has attracted rhetorical support from Beijing and Moscow. It has attracted very little else. China condemned what it described as a dangerous provocation. China is also the largest buyer of Iranian crude oil and has a direct economic interest in keeping the Strait of Hormuz open. But Beijing has not deployed naval assets to support Iran, has not threatened consequences for American strikes, and has not offered anything that resembles a concrete security commitment. China's relationship with Iran is transactional. It buys Iranian oil at a discount because Iranian oil is sanctioned and therefore cheap. That relationship does not extend to risking Chinese vessels or personnel in a confrontation with the U.S. Navy. Russia's position is rhetorically sharper, but practically similar. Moscow condemned American actions in strong terms while simultaneously benefiting from the situation those actions created. When the Strait of Hormuz comes under threat and global oil prices breach $100 per barrel, as they did immediately after the May 7th confrontation, Russia's oil export revenues increase significantly. Every tanker that turns back from Hormuz is a barrel that buyers need to source elsewhere, often from Russian producers. Moscow is not going to end a situation that is financially rewarding it. Iran's veto-bearing friends at the UN Security Council will use those vetoes. Beyond that, Thran is largely on its own. Iranian strategic communications in the aftermath of May 7th have gestured toward a scenario of coordinated escalation that would simultaneously close Hormuz, destroy undersea communications cables in the Gulf, and activate healthy forces to close the Bab-el-Mandeb Strait as well. The scenario is designed to present Iran as holding a trump card, the ability to destabilize the global economy in ways that would hurt everyone, not just Iran. The analysis deserves to be taken seriously because some of it is physically plausible. Iran has operational missiles that can reach the Yanbu pipeline in Saudi Arabia, which serves as a bypass route for Saudi oil if Hormuz closes. Fujairah, one of the world's largest fuel bunkering hubs, is within Iranian missile range and has been targeted in past incidents. Undersea communications. Cables in the Gulf are real. Infrastructure with real vulnerability. Iran's allied Houthi movement does have the capability to threaten traffic through Bab-el-Mandeb, but there is a profound difference between capability and cost-benefit rationality. Using any of these options would represent a categorical escalation from a confrontation with American naval forces in the Strait to a direct attack on Saudi Arabia's economic infrastructure, on UAE commercial facilities, and on the global financial communications system. It would complete Iran's isolation from every country whose diplomatic support it currently retains. It would give the United States and a fully unified Gulf coalition justification for a military response that would go far beyond anything Iran has experienced so far. Iran's deterrent cards are real, but they are also increasingly expensive to play. Each option carries a cost that exceeds the leverage it creates. The sea, denial doctrine, the IRGC built over decades. The strategy of overwhelming superior naval forces with swarm attacks, drone saturation, and coordinated missile barges was put to its most serious operational test on May 7th. It failed. This matters beyond the immediate military outcome. Military doctrines are also psychological frameworks. They tell an organization what it is capable of, what its enemies cannot handle, and what kind of conflict it can survive and prevail in. The IRGC's swarm doctrine was the ideological and practical core of its claim to be a credible military force against a technologically superior adversary. Aegis-equipped destroyers, it turns out, are specifically designed for exactly the kind of multi-axis, multi-domain saturation attack the IRGC launched. The system was built with this threat model in mind. On the night of May 7th, it performed as designed. Iran now faces a narrowing set of options, military options that have been tested and found wanting, economic options that are constrained by the physical limits of its infrastructure, diplomatic options that stop at the doors of the UN, Security Council. The missile cities along the southern coast, the ones Iran spent decades building and concealing, were never going to remain hidden forever. The question was always how they would be revealed. The answer on May 7th was by Iran itself. The Strait, at its narrowest point, is 54-kilometer wide. That number has become a kind of dark metaphor for Iran's strategic situation, a corridor that looks manageable on a map, but that is in practice controlled by whoever has the most capable ships, the most effective air defense, and the most comprehensive intelligence picture. On the night of May 7th, none of those advantages belonged to Thrawn.